When you hear the name Cleopatra, what comes to mind? A seductress who bewitched Roman generals, a woman whose beauty launched 1,000 ships. Hollywood has sold us a fantasy, but the real Cleopatra was far more extraordinary than any movie could capture. She wasn't Egyptian by blood. She wasn't even particularly beautiful by ancient accounts. Yet she became the most powerful woman in the ancient world, ruling Egypt for over 2 decades during one of history's most turbulent periods. This is the untold story of Cleopatra VII, a story of genius, ambition, survival, and the desperate fight to save a dying kingdom. Forget everything you think you know. The truth is so much better. Let's start with a fact that shocks most people. Cleopatra wasn't ethnically Egyptian. She was Greek, Macedonian Greek, to be precise. Her family, the Ptolemies, were descendants of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his vast empire was carved up among his commanders. Ptolemy seized Egypt and founded a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies governed Egypt, but remained stubbornly Greek. They lived in Alexandria, a gleaming Mediterranean city that was more Athens than Memphis. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods alongside Egyptian ones, and married within their own family to keep the bloodline pure. And I mean that literally. The Ptolemies practiced brother-sister marriage for generations. Cleopatra herself would eventually marry both of her younger brothers, though these were political arrangements, not love matches. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra was the daughter of Ptolemy XII, known mockingly as All-Eats or the flute player. He was a weak king who bought his throne from Rome with borrowed money, taxing Egypt into poverty to pay off his debts. But here's where Cleopatra was different from her ancestors. She actually cared about Egypt. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to bother learning the Egyptian language. She studied the ancient texts, participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and presented herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. This wasn't just political theater. Cleopatra understood something her family had forgotten. You cannot rule a country whose people you treat with contempt. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, 18-year-old Cleopatra inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Egypt was drowning in debt to Rome. Crop failures had led to famine. The kingdom her family had ruled for centuries was now little more than a Roman client state. According to her father's will, Cleopatra was to rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. In the Ptolemaic tradition, they were also married, though this was purely ceremonial. But Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power with a child. Within months, she had sidelined her brother completely, issuing royal decrees in her name alone and having her face printed on coins without his. This was unacceptable to the powerful men around the young Ptolemy, particularly his advisors, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetoric teacher Theodotus. They saw Cleopatra as a threat to their influence. In 49 BCE, they struck. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria as her brother's forces seized control. She escaped to Syria, where she began raising an army. Civil war was coming to Egypt, but fate had other plans, because while Cleopatra was in exile, the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in its own civil war, and the most powerful man in Rome was about to arrive in Egypt, changing everything. His name was Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey the Great. But Ptolemy's advisors had already murdered Pompey, hoping to win Caesar's favor. They were wrong. Caesar was furious that a Roman consul had been assassinated by foreigners. Cleopatra saw her opportunity. She needed to reach Caesar before her brother's advisors could poison him against her. But the palace was guarded, and she was wanted in the city. So she devised one of history's most famous gambits. According to ancient sources, she had herself rolled up in a carpet or possibly a laundry sack and smuggled into Caesar's chambers by a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus. Imagine Caesar's shock when a carpet was unrolled and out stepped the rightful queen of Egypt. Now, legend says Caesar was immediately smitten by her beauty. But Roman historians who actually saw Cleopatra tell a different story. Plutarch wrote that her beauty was not in itself completely incomparable. Another writer described her as having a large nose and masculine features. So what captivated Caesar? Her mind. Ancient sources are unanimous on this point. It was her intelligence, her wit, her charm, and her voice that made her irresistible. She spoke 9 languages fluently. She could discuss philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and politics with equal brilliance. She was also a master of presentation. She understood power dynamics and spectacle. She didn't just enter a room. She made an entrance that would be remembered for 2,000 years. Caesar, 52 years old and at the height of his power, was indeed captivated. But this wasn't a one-sided seduction. These were 2 of history's greatest strategic minds recognizing each other as equals. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth to fund his ambitions. Cleopatra needed Rome's military might to secure her throne. They became lovers. But more importantly, they became allies. Caesar's support of Cleopatra enraged Ptolemy's advisors. What followed was the Alexandrian War, a vicious conflict that nearly killed Caesar and saw much of Alexandria's great library destroyed in fires. The war was brutal and chaotic. Caesar and Cleopatra were besieged in the palace district for months. At one point, Caesar had to swim for his life through the harbor, holding important documents above his head. But Rome's military superiority eventually prevailed. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while fleeing the final battle, weighed down by his golden armor. Cleopatra had won. She was installed as queen alongside her youngest brother, 11-year-old Ptolemy XIV, who was no threat to her power, and she was pregnant with Caesar's child. In 47 BCE, she gave birth to a son she named Ptolemy Caesar, though he was known by a nickname that would follow him to his tragic end: Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra had achieved something remarkable. She had taken a weak kingdom and bound it to the most powerful man in the world. Egypt's future seemed secure, but Caesar's future was not. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra made a bold move. She traveled to Rome itself, bringing her brother husband and her infant son. Caesar installed her in his villa across the Tiber River. Romans were scandalized. Here was a foreign queen living openly as Caesar's mistress while he had a Roman wife. Worse, Caesar had placed a golden statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genitrix, his ancestral goddess. It was unprecedented, blasphemous, and to many Romans, proof that Caesar had become a tyrant. But Cleopatra had Caesar's protection, and Caesar seemed untouchable. He was declared dictator for life. Some whispered he wanted to be king, which was the greatest taboo in Roman politics. Then came the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Caesar was assassinated by senators who claimed they were saving the Republic. He was stabbed 23 times at the foot of Pompey's statue. Cleopatra's world collapsed. She fled Rome immediately, returning to Alexandria. Shortly after, her brother husband Ptolemy XIV died under mysterious circumstances. Most historians believe Cleopatra had him poisoned, clearing the way to rule alongside her son Caesarion. Egypt was hers alone now. But without Caesar, how long could she hold it? The Roman Republic descended into another civil war. On one side were Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius. On the other were Caesar's heirs, his adopted son Octavian and his loyal general Mark Antony. After defeating the assassins, Antony took control of Rome's eastern territories. In 41 BCE, he summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. He wanted to question her loyalty and demand tribute. Cleopatra knew this was another moment where everything hung in the balance. So once again, she made an entrance for the ages. She sailed up the river on a golden barge with purple sails. She was dressed as Venus, surrounded by attendants dressed as Cupids, while the air was filled with the scent of perfumes. Musicians played as she reclined under a canopy of gold cloth. Antony had meant to intimidate her. Instead, she overwhelmed him. Mark Antony was not Julius Caesar. He was a skilled general, but a less sophisticated politician. He loved luxury, parties, and pleasure, and Cleopatra offered all three, along with the wealth of Egypt and her formidable intelligence. They became lovers almost immediately. Antony spent the winter of 4140 BCE in Alexandria, living in luxury while his political position in Rome weakened. Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named after the sun and moon. 3 years later, she would bear Antony another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. But this relationship was more than romance. Antony needed Egypt's resources for his military campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman protection and hoped to expand Egypt's territory. Together, they dreamed of creating an Eastern empire that could rival or even surpass Rome. It was a dream that would destroy them both. Back in Rome, Octavian was turning public opinion against Antony. He portrayed Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Rome for an Eastern witch. He spread propaganda claiming Cleopatra had bewitched Antony and planned to rule Rome from Alexandria. In 32 BCE, Octavian declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, making her Rome's enemy. The showdown came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, a naval battle off the coast of Greece. It was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Their fleet was outmaneuvered, and in the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's ships withdrew and sailed for Egypt. Antony abandoned his fleet and followed her. They had lost. Egypt was finished. For a year, they waited in Alexandria as Octavian advanced. They threw lavish parties, made suicide pacts, and prepared for the end. Cleopatra tested various poisons on condemned prisoners, searching for the most painless death. In August of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces breached Alexandria. Antony, receiving false news that Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword. He botched the suicide and was carried, dying, to Cleopatra's tomb. He died in her arms. Cleopatra was now Octavian's prisoner. He planned to parade her through Rome in chains as part of his triumph, the ultimate humiliation. She would not give him that satisfaction. On August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra died. The ancient sources say she was bitten by an asp, a venomous snake smuggled to her in a basket of figs. Modern historians question this account, suggesting she may have used poison instead. However she died, it was on her own terms. She was 39 years old. Cleopatra's death marked the end of ancient Egypt. Octavian annexed the kingdom, murdered Caesarion to eliminate any rival claim to Caesar's legacy, and took Cleopatra's remaining children back to Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries was finished. Egypt would not be independent again for 2,000 years. But here's what Rome's propaganda couldn't erase. Cleopatra had ruled Egypt for 22 years during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. She had maintained her kingdom's independence when it should have become a Roman province. She had negotiated with the most powerful men in the world as an equal, not as a subject. She was a scholar, a linguist, a strategist, and a survivor. Yes, she used her relationships with Caesar and Antony to political advantage. But they used her just as much. This wasn't a story of seduction. It was a story of 2 partnerships between brilliant, ambitious people playing for the highest stakes imaginable. History, written by Roman men who conquered Egypt, turned her into a cautionary tale about female ambition and foreign influence. They made her a villain, a seductress, a threat to Roman virtue. But Cleopatra was none of those things. She was a queen who fought with every weapon she had to save her kingdom. She didn't seduce Rome. She simply understood that in a world dominated by Roman military power, survival required thinking 10 steps ahead. That's the untold story of Cleopatra. Not a woman who used her beauty to manipulate men, but a brilliant leader who played the most dangerous game in history and almost won.